Let's now turn our attention to 9/11. We're going to focus in this presentation on some important events that preceded 9/11 and that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda and the rise of Muslim extremism. One of the most important events that occurred before 9/11 was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Until 1979, Iran was an extremely pro-Western nation in the middle of the Muslim world. The United States had been instrumental in establishing the rule of the Shah of Iran, and the Shah repaid America with allegiance to the United States and a pro-Western stance. So the Shah encouraged American, European, and other North American businesses, Canadian especially, to invest in Iran and to come to Iran. Tehran was viewed as one of the most progressive cities in the Muslim world. It had all kinds of Western decadence, nightclubs, sex clubs, all kinds of establishments, gambling, all kinds of things that would not normally have been seen in a Muslim country, a Muslim-dominated country. So the Shah had very much implemented and established a secular government that was pro-Western. And the United States rewarded his allegiance with support, financial support, military support, but also a willingness to overlook the Shah's extreme human rights violations. The Shah maintained, in order to maintain his power over his people, he controlled a secret police that carried out torture, executions, incarcerations, all kinds of human rights violations. And the Western world, including the Americans, turned a blind eye to his violations. The Iranian people did not tolerate these violations, and eventually protests led to a full-scale revolution that resulted in the Shah being removed from power in 1979, and also resulted in the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran. American embassy workers were held hostage for over 400 days. They were held hostage from 1979 until January of 1981. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a religious leader, eventually returned from exile in France to come back to Iran and to lead a strictly religious-based government that implemented Muslim law. And so Iran went from a valuable pro-Western ally to a country that was one of the most strictly fundamentalist governments and cultures in the world. At this time, the United States was at one of its lowest points in its history. The United States had just withdrawn in the mid-70s from Vietnam, and so that was the first real defeat to American military power. The oil embargo that led to the fuel crisis in the mid-1970s also helped to precipitate an economic recession, so inflation and unemployment were extremely high. And now you had a country that most Americans were not familiar with, Iran, was not seen as a world superpower like the Soviets or the Chinese, that was able to basically hold not only American embassy workers hostage, but really America hostage for over a year. And so the hostage situation dominated the news headlines. It didn't seem like most people thought, why can't America just go in and get the hostages out and end this thing? Well, it didn't happen. In fact, the United States did try a military operation, but it failed miserably in the desert. Helicopters crashing into each other resulted in the complete failure of the mission. So you had Americans being taken on directly in Iran. The American flag was regularly burned on TV as the images of the hostages were also displayed on TV for the world to see. It really seemed that America was being held captive by a relatively small nation, and that America could do very little to prevent it. So this really inspired Muslim extremists around the world to dream and imagine that America and the rest of the Western world could be challenged, and that strict Muslim rule could be initiated and established in countries throughout the Muslim world. Another important event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. At the time of the invasion, the United States and the Soviet Union were fully engaged in the Cold War, and each had their own respected zones of influence. The United States viewed Afghanistan as being outside the normal Soviet zone of influence, and so the United States took a tough stance towards the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979. America called for the removal of the Soviet troops, but the Soviets refused. In response, the Americans boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics and brought about other economic sanctions against the Soviets. Nevertheless, the Soviets remained in Afghanistan. The Soviets didn't face great resistance. They did face resistance, but not great resistance, because the Afghanistan military forces were not very advanced. They had outdated equipment. They were fighting with World War II and sometimes even World War rifles against Soviet helicopters and jets and advanced artillery and other weaponry. And so they were able to hold on because of the tough terrain of Afghanistan. It was difficult for the Soviets to, even though they quickly took over the Afghanistan government, it was hard for them to maintain control over all of Afghanistan. There were instances of rebellion throughout the country, and the Soviets couldn't completely suppress it. As the war dragged on, it became less popular in the Soviet Union. Everyone expected a really quick military operation that would be over in no time, but that didn't happen. It dragged on and on and on. And so, like for the United States a decade before, Afghanistan was becoming the Vietnam for the Soviet Union. The United States decided to hasten the problems of the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so if you've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, you know some of the events that took place, that an American legislator, Charlie Wilson, really took up the cause of the Afghan rebels and was able to provide funding, and with working with the CIA, was able to provide training and funding and weaponry to the Afghan rebels. Now, the United States didn't want to do this directly because they didn't want to start World War III with the Russians. So instead they worked through intermediaries, and mainly Pakistani intelligence. So the U.S. would bring Pakistani intelligence officers to the United States to train them, and also they would provide them with weaponry. Now, initially the weapons were Soviet-made weapons because the United States didn't want any Afghan rebels to be caught with American-made weapons that would directly implicate the United States in the war. So instead, the United States bought Soviet-made weapons from Egypt, from other sources, gave them to the Pakistan intelligence services, who then went to Afghanistan to arm the Afghan rebels and also to train them. As the war continued, eventually America did assume a more direct role. And eventually the United States would arm the Afghan rebels with American-made weapons. Again, doing it through the Pakistani intelligence services. So one of the most important weapons was the Stinger missile, which had the capability of bringing down Soviet aircraft, and which was relatively easy to be trained to use, for a person to be trained to use, and but nevertheless was very effective. So these weapons were given to the Pakistani intelligence and military, and most of them they all were supposed to go to the Afghan rebels, but a lot of them were kept by the Pakistanis as well. But nonetheless, the Afghan rebels were able to use these weapons to bring down Soviet jets and helicopters, and this really turned the tide of the war, especially in favor of the Afghans. So the Soviets again, their war effort was becoming even more unpopular in the Soviet Union. It was a huge economic drain, and there were calls in the Soviet Union to withdraw. Now, at the same time, a call went out to the Muslim world for young fighters to come to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets, who were viewed as the infidels, the non-believers. This was that generation's opportunity to prove themselves. And so many answered the call and came to Afghanistan. Now, if you listen to them, they were the ones who won the war, when that really wasn't true. It was the trained Afghan rebels with American military assistance and Pakistani intelligence assistance who really won the war against the Soviets. But nonetheless, the image of these freedom fighters, these mujahideen as they were known, coming to Afghanistan to fight for the cause, was really seen as heroic and something that could inspire others in the Muslim world. Again, their military abilities weren't so great. They were amateurs who really didn't know how to fight, who came to Afghanistan, and many of them were better equipped to die than to kill Soviets. But nonetheless, Mujahideen did come to Afghanistan, and one of them was Osama bin Laden. Now, there are different spellings of his first name, and I'm using the FBI's version. The FBI spells Osama with a U. But Osama bin Laden was more of a financier and construction expert than he was a warrior. There are images of him on the battlefield fighting, but those were really propaganda images meant to inflate his image as a warrior. He was really important because his family owned one of the wealthiest construction businesses in Saudi Arabia, and they had close connections to the Saudi royal family. So Osama bin Laden was able to bring his money, his wealth, and equipment and business know-how in the construction industry to Afghanistan to build roads and landing strips that were critical to winning the war against the Soviets. Eventually, the Soviets did withdraw from Afghanistan in 1988. Americans would, in the American clandestine services, the CIA and others would probably still say today that the efforts against the Soviets were a success in Afghanistan, even if it did result in the Mujahideen eventually forming alliances, many of them forming alliances that would lead to Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. Because the victory against the Soviets in the Afghan War really did hasten the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. But it could have been a more complete victory if America had taken more actions to de-radicalize the Mujahideen. Instead, the Americans did very little in that regard. So instead of these fighters going back to their homeland, living out the rest of their lives, talking about their glory days in Afghanistan, many formed alliances, and among these was bin Laden forming alliances with other Mujahideen to turn their attention to Western powers, to form groups such as Al-Qaeda that would carry out attacks against the Western world. They were emboldened by their efforts in Afghanistan. They came together, formed alliances, and again, these alliances would eventually be used against the United States and Western powers.